Good afternoon to everyone. I want to come to you today to visit with you about the game of stickball for the Cherokee people. It would have been nice to be able to be with each and every one of you in person where we could play the game, but this gives me the opportunity to come and share with you a little bit of the knowledge that I've gained over the years from many of the teachers that I've had from east to west. So it's my pleasure to come and speak to you just a little bit about Ani Jordan. Now, for the Cherokee people, Ani Jordan was a way to settle grievances in our own tribes, in our own villages, as well as with our surrounding tribes there in the southeastern part of the United States. And for us as Cherokee people, Ani Jordan was a very high honor to participate in. In the early days, it was mainly a sport meant for men, again called the little brother of war. There were several things that had to take place in order for you to participate, several different rules, and as you begin to search out the game of stickball on the internet and on YouTube and other social media sources, you find those rules and regulations and so on and so forth. But today what I want to share with you about the game of Ani Jordan, trying to share with you just some of the things that may be just a little bit different than what you've heard. The game of Ani Jordan for the Cherokee people, according to some of the research that I've done, was outlawed for the Cherokee people in the early 1900s due to its brutality, being seen by many of the diplomats and politicians and so on and so forth, thinking that the game was very barbaric, not understanding what it was meant for and why it was used. And so it wasn't until the past 15 or 20 years that we as Cherokee people have taken up the game of Ani Jordan, the man-on-man game. Out of the man-on-man game, it is said that it was a very brutal game, that death did sometimes happen. But in those instances when death did take place, there was no stoppage to the game. The player was simply, whether injured or passed away, would be taken off of the field. And the player on the opposite side, he too would have to leave the game. And so with this, we were preserving life, even though it may not seem so. But if we actually went into battle with each other, there were hundreds of individuals killed, whereas in the game of stickball there were very few. When it became outlawed for us as Cherokee people, there was a new game that came into existence. And this new game today is more widely known among our people, among our ceremonial grounds. And it is the pole game. The pole game is a man-woman version. In the Ani Jordan game, the sticks, very similar to something like this, made from hickory. I was always told that hickory was used because it was easier to work with, easier to bend. I was told, and I've done several pairs that way, that if the wood is cut on a certain moon sign, that wood can be bent by hand, and it can be without having to boil it or so on and so forth. Today, the sticks are works of art, lasting a long time. This pair that I have right here is well over 50 years old, if not more so. But the way that I was told back then was that these sticks were not made to keep forever. And so what they would use a lot of times they were using the limbs from the trees, and they would bend them over and web them up. Now I've heard a lot of people tell me that there were different patterns for the webbing there in the middle. Today there are patterns that are recognized as Cherokee, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Seminoles, and Creeks. I imagine back then whatever sufficed would work for the individual. But the ball itself, I was told in the Ani Jordan game, the man-on-man game, that the ball was actually a flying squirrel. That our medicine was so strong back then that they would capture a flying squirrel and they would tie him up with the tail. That tail acts as a flutter. In the Creek game, the man-on-man game, they have a flutter And what that does is that allows the ball to slow down in its travel so that it doesn't travel from one end of the field to the other. They would say that after the ball game was over, that they would take that flying squirrel and unwrap him. And again, because our medicine was so strong at that time, that there was no harm that came to that flying squirrel. Today, the ball looks something similar like this, about as big as a golf ball. On the inside would be a stone, a pebble, about as big as your thumbnail for the weight, and around that was wrapped deer fur, deer hair. Later on, I was told, as a horse came into existence, it was later wrapped with horsehair. Today, many use cotton yarn or cotton twine. On the outside was deer hide. Now, the ball that I was originally told had one seam from the top to the bottom. Today, many of these balls, the seams look like a miniature baseball. But regardless of how it was made or what it looked like, it had a purpose. In our game, as the pole game, the man-woman game, the man still uses the sticks. He cannot touch the ball with his hands. In many of the stories, which one of them I will share just a little bit later, these are called spoons. Now, in our man-woman game, the women, they hold the greater advantage using their hands. And what they throw at is, for the Cherokee, at the top of a pole, anywhere from 30 to 40, 45 feet high, there sits a fish on the top. Now, that fish, by hitting that fish, scores you somewhere around 7 points, and by hitting the pole below the fish scores you 1 point. There are ways that we scored the game, and I'll leave that there at the ceremonial grounds. If you want to know those scorings, you will have to come and visit us. But the man-woman game, as in many of our things, was always a teacher. Now, the men, the young boys, learned how to use these as an extension of their arms. The cups here were their hands. They learned to catch. They learned to throw. They learned how to fake the ladies out, and many times even today when you do that, it kind of aggravates the women. But again, as I said, the women hold the greater advantage, being able to use their hands and pry the sticks open and take the ball out of the sticks. Now, today's game, the pole game, has become very rough. And sometimes it's fun for the individuals until somebody gets hurt. I was always taught that this game was meant as a social game. Though it did find its roots there in the ceremonies, it is a social game between the men and the women. This was a chance for the women to come and see who was there. Many times there were visitors that came from other towns. And so they were always looking to see, and the men were always there, just like today. When a young man is trying to show off there on the playground shooting a basketball, he may try to shoot his best three or whatever the case may be. Well, so the stickball player was doing the same, whether he was catching or passing, throwing the ball. And so the women would giggle around as the men would chase them. It was a flirting game. It was a pre-courtship game. It was fun. The sticks could be taken away, and a lot of times the way that I was told was that the sticks were never slung across the field as they are today, but they were simply taken away from the men and tossed to the side as the women would take the ball and run off giggling. That's a far cry from what we see today whenever teachers tell them that there were no rules for the women, though there really aren't any rules. But we do understand that women are still women. And so you must act accordingly. The women, their object of the game is to score. The men, their object of the game is to score. It does take a little practice using the sticks, and by using the sticks, these sticks are a teacher. They teach you to practice. They teach you to work hard. Many times I've seen young men want to give up and cry around about, oh, when are the women going to use the sticks? Well, in our games, the women don't. And so you must practice. You must become consistent. You must be patient. I've always been taught that if you lose your temper in the game, that you must have self-control. And it would be better for you to leave the game on your own, sit out a little while, calm down, and then come back into the game, instead of an elder to come and tell you that you must go and sit down. And so this game is a teacher. This game is also a teacher for the women, showing them and teaching them that they must work together. Because many times, as you will see in our games, the women, as they all begin to come together, they will fake the men out as they come together in a crowd and then disperse, no one knowing where the ball is. And so this game is still teaching our individuals today, whether they be young, whether they be old. Now, as a storyteller, I understand many of these things that I've learned through storytelling. And so today I want to share a story that was shared to me many years ago. And I consider this gentleman a great friend. He's gone on to be with our Lord. But he shared many wonderful things, and he was a talented artist. And this is a story that he shared with me about the game of stickball. He said, one day as G-Stu, the trickster rabbit, was walking down the path, he came to an open field, and there in the open field, there was a group of boys. And these boys, they were whooping and hollering, and there was a crowd that was cheering off on the side. And as G-Stu, the rabbit, sat there and began to watch, he noticed as the boys would stop and the ball would be thrown up into the air, and the boys would whoop, woo! And when the ball would come down, they would begin to wrestle for it. And soon one would grab the ball and they would take off running. Rabbit became so interested in the game that his interest began to guide his feet. When the ball went to this side of the field, there ran the rabbit on the sidelines. And when the ball came this way, here came the rabbit. In all the excitement, the ball rolled out, and there stood Rabbit looking at the ball. And it was about that time some of the young men saw Rabbit standing there and said, "Hey, look, there's G-Stu. Why don't we let him play?" Now G-Stu, he began to look around. He said, "You want me to play?" Oh, G-Stu was very excited as he ran onto the field. And, he was excited. He was hyped up as they threw the ball up into the air, and everyone hooped, including the rabbits. When the ball came down, the boys began to wrestle for it, and there ran the rabbit around that circle of young men, not really knowing what to do. And when one of the young men came out with the ball, there was the rabbit running side by side. When someone tackled him, the ball would roll on the ground, and Rabbit would look around and say, "There it is, there it is, there it is." And one of the boys would pick it up and run back the other way, and there was Rabbit running right beside him. They threw the ball up, and it came down in the middle of the young men, and everyone was wrestling with it as Rabbit was running around that circle of young men. And all of a sudden, the ball rolled out to Rabbit's feet. Rabbit began to look around, wondering what to do as he was trying to blurt out, "Here it is, here it is, here it is." And someone said, "Rabbit, pick it up and throw it." Rabbit, in all his excitement, reached down and picked the ball up. And with that little bitty short arm, he threw it, and it went right there. Everyone stopped playing. The crowd stopped cheering. And all of a sudden, someone said, "Rabbit, pick it up and throw it." And so the rabbit, he reached down and picked that ball up and threw it as hard as he could, and it went right there. Everyone began to laugh. And there stood the rabbit, all embarrassed, very upset that they were laughing at him. The young boys gathered around and began to make fun of him and said, "Rabbit, go away. You're not even a good player. You're just a fast runner. You go away, you just leave us alone and never come back to play again." And so as Rabbit stomped off down the path, he was already thinking of a way to get back at the young men. As he was trying to think of this plan to get even, a smell came over the air. and his mind went from getting even to supper. Oh, there was a smell of soup, and the rabbit's stomach began to growl. Rabbit thought to himself, oh my goodness, I'm going to get in trouble. You see, he'd already been kicked out of town several times and was told to never come back. But Rabbit had to have something to eat. And so the rabbit, he began to crawl along the edge of town. You see, many of you may have thought that rabbits only hop, but when they are trying to sneak around, they will crawl. He crawled all the way around to the other side of town, and there were the women cooking. Rabbit could smell the soup. Oh my goodness. And his stomach was growling so loud, and Rabbit reached up blindly, looking for something. And he grabbed a hold of a handle. He jerked it down, and he had a spoon, and he began to lick that spoon. Oh, that soup was so wonderful. Rabbit reached up in his greed to find another spoon and grabbed another handle. But just as he was pulling that other spoon down, someone grabbed him by the wrist, picked him up from behind the table, and said, "Gee, Stu, you know you're not allowed in town." And so the woman flung him once, flung him twice, and third time let him go, and as he went flying through the air. Rabbit could have been very upset, but in each hand he held a spoon. And when he landed on the ground, he took off running with a smile on his face. When he got home, he began to lick those spoons until all the soup was gone. Oh, he was so full. He felt so good. And as he sat there with his spoons in his hand, he began to play with them. And upon instinct, he just kind of reached down and picked up a rock and tossed it. And it went flying through the trees. Rabbit's thinker started thinking. He began to look at those spoons, and he picked up another stone, and he threw it, and it went flying through the trees. Rabbit was very excited, but there was something that he couldn't see, and he couldn't see if he had picked up a stone or not. And so he took those spoons and he chewed the backs off. He reached down to pick up a stone, and the stone fell out of the back. He had just ruined his spoons. He threw them on the ground in frustration and took off, walking to the creek to get a drink of water. As he was walking to the creek, he walked straight into a spider's web. I know we've all done it a time or two as we're walking through the woods. And how icky and nasty that spider web feels on your face. Well, Rabbit felt that same way, as it was also on his ears. As he pulled that sticky substance from his ears and from his face, he got another idea. He slung the spider web to the side and took off running back to his house. He began to pull the bark off of those trees and chew it, and he made a string and tied it onto the backs of those spoons. He reached down and picked up a stone, and he could see it. He tossed the stone back and forth, and he threw it, and it went through the woods. He was set and ready. He put the spoons in his backpack, and he started walking back to the ball field with confidence. He stood there for a little while, waiting, and soon the boys noticed him. "Look, there's G-Stu with those little bitty short arms. Why is he back here?" Rabbit just stood there, not saying a word. Soon the boys had gathered up around the rabbit and again was ridiculing him. The rabbit stood there, and he looked up at the young man and he said, "I come back because I come to challenge you. I come to challenge the very best of you that if you can throw further than I can, then I will go away and I will leave you alone forever. But if I can throw further than your best player, then anybody can play the game. There was a tall young man. As he came walking through that crowd of young men, he said, I am the best player. I take your challenge. And so they walked to the end of the field. Rabbit stood there. He said, since this is your field, you go first. And so the young man stepped forward and picked up a ball. He looked at that ball and took one step, and with one mighty heave, he threw the ball and went sailing through the air. Everyone began to cheer and clap as it sailed out over the end of the field and out into the woods. Their champion had done a great deed. Rabbit, he stood there, quite impressed. He said, do you want to try it again? The young man said, no, that is my best throw I've ever done. He said, G. Stu, it is your turn. So G. Stu took out his spoons, and everyone was wondering, what is he going to do? Rabbit picked up a ball. He took one step, and he threw the ball, and it went flying through the air. There was no cheering. There was no clapping, no yelling or screaming for the rabbit. There was just disbelief in that rabbit could throw the ball like that. As the ball went sailing through the air out over the goalpost, topping the trees, and disappeared. And all of a sudden, someone said, hey, do that again. And so the rabbit picked up another ball. And this time with one mighty, mighty throw, he let the ball go. It went sailing through the air, out over the trees, and they never heard it hit. Many of the old ones used to say that that same ball is that moon that now circles the earth. Everyone began to cheer and clap as they were proud of Rabbit. And everyone began to say, I want Rabbit on my team, I want Rabbit on my team. And Rabbit, in disgust, he took his spoons and he threw them on the ground. He said, I don't even want to play this game no more. He said, but from now on, he said, all boys, all males must use the spoons because you thought you were better than everybody else. And Rabbit walked off, knowing that he had conquered yet another obstacle. Today, whenever you are playing the game of stickball, whether it be Ani Jodi or the pole game, I want you to remember this story, because somewhere out on the edge of the field, there is the grandchildren of that very first G. Stu the rabbit. And he is watching to see if everyone is playing the game right. He is making sure that the young men are using the spoon. Making sure that they're using the spoons like they were supposed to. Today, we use these in honor of our people that have gone on, in honor of the stories as we continue to promote these ways. I hope you've enjoyed just a little bit of history about the game of stickball, and also the stories that were told to me when I was just a child. Thank you.